wanted to make a video because last week I read these two books, the Antifa comic book, anti-fascist movements for the last 100 years or so, and then I also read this book on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. So I thought that they actually worked well together because they both did talk, of course, about World War II, the Nazi regime, and the fascism, that went along with that. I think it was great just because I in school I recall learning about the Nazis and kind of focusing on there's always a lot of history to learn, and so I don't think I focused on the other countries that were involved in Germany's takeover as much. I tried to just remember the main details of Germany as the main player, England, Winston Churchill, French history was one of my big ones, so German occupation of France, of half of France or so, and then the resistance in that country as well. So I did not focus necessarily on the fascists, the fascist movements that were happening like in Spain, in Italy as much. So I thought that this was very interesting. It was good to learn about. It talked about kind of where it generally comes from, having systems where there aren't just the two political parties, but like in America, we primarily have Democrats, Republicans, but of course we do have other, like the Green Party and just other ones that'll crop up. It was talking about historically, how they may have started out as small parties and how they grew into something bigger. So it talked about how they had a strong nationalist focus, trying to use patriotism to bring people together in the hopes of creating a unified country. It talked about how oftentimes they might play on themes that are more liberal, more socialist, and some of the fascist movements did move over to were not deemed specifically fascist, but were deemed as like socialist. And you can see that when Obama became president, everyone was calling him a socialist, and that was anti-capitalism, anti-America. And so it kind of talked about how they will sometimes play on those themes of catering to the lower classes, of catering to those who are vulnerable, I guess, who are of lower class, and trying to motivate them, engage them in politics, and generally it also talked about how military would kind of they were not afraid of using military and violent forces to overthrow governments, have those coups, a coup d'etat, and try to take force in that way. Talked about having annual marches through the city to try and boost the morale. Of course, it did say that they were going against the established, nationalists, because they weren't doing their job for whatever, maybe numbers were low, for helping, in helpful ways for minorities. So that was their opening to start saying that the established government wasn't doing its job, and then trying to play on those who were in need to rebuild, their a new class, or better class type of people, and things like that. I thought it was interesting. It was I was surprised because I definitely kind of assigned fascism to the past, and it did bring in to recognition the movements that are still present. I mean, you will hear about skinheads, and the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is historically American, and so and I do, I do assign to history as well, but you do hear about sects of people who come back together and reignite those parties and those ideologies, and sometimes they do take, they do blame a specific subset of society for problems, which is why they worked well, and they did end up, in Italy, for example, they did support anti-Jewish beliefs. So that was something that they did. They did support anti-Semitism. So that was one thing that was kind of established in the book. And the Ku Klux Klan obviously was against black people in the United States. And so just talking about those different movements, skinheads, and how it's not even necessarily like political as much anymore. I talked about like rock music and trying to unite people in violence with pop cultural movements versus political movements, to get action and to form these groups of people who are willing to, fight for and take governance into their own hands. Kind of interesting, definitely worth reading, especially since I was so focused on the Nazis. I didn't worry, about necessarily the fascists as much, but of course they are a big part of history, so I'm glad I was able to rehash this as a topic. But this book I thought was interesting. This one's just on tyranny in general, and that was big in the times. Yeah, the founding fathers, this was big. Obviously, they don't talk about tyranny necessarily in relation to Nazi Germany. They do talk about tyranny, but it's definitely, in my mind at least, associated with like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the tyrannical leaders, the British taxing without representation and things like that. But this goes hand in hand with fascism and kind of dominance, overthrows. So it mentioned that one of the techniques was for them to get power. You can start casting blame on the current government for it not working, but they also will find catalysts in social movements, if and you'll see that too, where like a news story that might fade into nothing or may not play into much on a federal level gets huge media attention, specifically to boost a narrative, to boost a point, to try and raise awareness for gun laws and legislation and inequality and social justice. So lots of different examples that might fade, but sometimes there are just times where the media is just slammed, where it's that was something where black people we can work with that, and then there was another incident, and then maybe in groups of 3, but it said that some of those were even staged by fascists to give them that platform to be able to cite that as the failing of the current system and to try and bring people together. So but the book on tyranny I thought was interesting. It was nice because it talks about maintaining your autonomy and your ability to recognize tyranny and to recognize movements like fascism, because they play on everything you want to hear about, building equality and on bringing people together and fixing things that aren't working, and that appeals to everybody, a large audience, and then trying to stay awake from it, or trying to stay awake to it. This book kind of talks about do not obey in advance, don't give them the power, and don't bow down, because they might not be able to actually orchestrate what they're hoping to accomplish without immediate obeisance. Defending institutions, bewailing the one-party state, responsibility for the face of the world, remember professional ethics, so wary of paramilitaries, and that's like this paramilitaries. This one was talking about gang wars and the violence that would be incurred at marches, which we actually just saw, with the marches in California with the Hispanics. Trump sent in military forces, which is kind of in the fascist playbook, so you can make parallels, of course, with the current government and fascism, and that's a whole nother video and a half, so I should make it, and maybe I will make it, but also being kind to our language, belief in truth, investigate, so there's a whole list of things to, be a patriot, be calm when the unthinkable arrives, listen for dangerous words, dangerous rhetorics of people starting to point fingers and trying to build hatred, instead of trying to keep people together. So overall, this was a good couple of books for me to read as just something to reflect on, especially with the new presidential regime, just especially since I was not well versed on fascism. Someone had said, obviously it's been all over the media, but there's such media saturation of hatred in the political sphere, especially with Trump's second election and second win. So, but they, in fact, they've been crying fascism, I think, since the beginning. And so I also believe in political change, and I feel like our system is inefficient, but I believe in my liberal perspectives and taking care of the LGBTQ community and the BIPOC populations, and so it's a weird balance here, and definitely worth paying attention to what your government is doing and what's going on, as much as you can be aware of that stuff. Of course, Trump also did bring the military in without quote unquote without official authority to take out the nukes overseas, and that was a big news story as well. So lots of buzzwords and things happening with the current political situation. Lots of pro-military. Of course, I remember from the speeches before when he was running. I didn't pay attention. I didn't watch his campaign because I'm not known to be far right in any regard, to be Republican per se, and so but I try to keep an open mind politically and listen to what's saying. I don't always align specifically with one house. I want to hear what they have to say, and I want to look at the platforms as separate entities outside of their parties. But of course, that's where the power play comes in, because of the parties, the forces that go into that, and all of the representation. And so we can't necessarily separate them because of the loyalty and the trying to whip votes for certain legislation and things like that. It's all very much interconnected, so we cannot separate the argument from the party per se. but and of course, given the powers that that have supported the elections, very much so an interesting conversation, very much so an engaging conversation to stay involved and to kind of keep alert on what's happening in our politics, because I do still believe in people's sovereignty, and but I do, and that's complicated and we don't need to get into that, but I do feel like we need to have those forces that are mindful and keep people in check, because with great power does come great responsibility, and sometimes things can get lost, like important things can get lost in public movements where a lot of power is given and exchanged, and a lot of beliefs are hung on to an idea. So recognizing people and their failings, as well as their humanity, is very important to me as well. So, but this has been very interesting, very cool to read. I'm gonna keep on reading. I'm reading for a 50 book challenge, and I of course left it where I had to read, like, what was it, 25 books or so in 2 months. So these are very short and also very informative. So good to stay in the conversation and maybe restart the conversation like it did with the fascist movements, but just to keep involved and engaged in what's happening in our society and in our community. And yeah, let's keep it going.